Today we'll be continuing with our studies in Daniel chapter 11. We have already come to the very last verses. In fact, the very last verse in that chapter. We talked about it last time when we discussed this subject. And today we are going to look at it again so that we can get more knowledge, more history, and see how these verses are applicable to some of the things that are taking place in the world today. As you can see, the title of the message is The Eastern Question, Then and Now. That phrase, the Eastern Question, has become part of the various prophetic books that have been written within Seventh-day Adventism. We mentioned this in the past, but we can find this phrase in the Sabbath School Quarterlies. We can find this phrase in the various prophetic books by different authors within the Seventh-day Adventist movement, particularly during the time of Ellen White. We can find this phrase in Bible readings for the home circle as well from that very period. And it has really become synonymous with something in particular, and it is the study of Daniel chapter 11. In fact, Ellen White herself has referred to this phrase on numerous occasions. So here's one of those instances when she brings out the fact that the church was involved in helping people understand the connection between prophecy and current events. Here we're looking at a letter that was written in 1884, and Ellen White gives a synopsis of a few things that have been going on and a few presentations that were taking place. And she says, the evening meeting, she's talking about a series of meetings that have been taking place. The evening meeting was largely attended. Elder Smith, in this particular case, spoke with great clearness, and many listened with open eyes, ears, and mouths. So that tells us that people were very interested to hear what Elder Smith had to say at this particular meeting. She goes on and says, the outsiders seemed to be intensely interested in the Eastern question. Intensely. So there wasn't just an interest, but there was an intense interest to this subject, the subject of the Eastern question, specifically from what she refers to as the outsiders. So this was not just a meeting where baptized members must have been present. This is a meeting where prophecy had been open for people outside of the faith to understand, and it was the Eastern question in particular, as we can see here, that they were intensely interested in. So where does that phrase come from? Well, first and foremost, we have to start with the Bible, right? Is the phrase the Eastern question found in the Bible? No, it isn't. It is just connected to a passage in the Bible, specifically found in Daniel chapter 11, a passage that we began talking about in the last presentation. So the Eastern question, when we hear that phrase within Seventh-day Adventism, the Eastern question was related to the understanding of the church with respect to Daniel chapter 11, verse 45. So in Daniel 11:45, the Bible says, and he, speaking of the king of the north, shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas in the glorious holy mountain, yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help him. So the Eastern question is a subject connected to this very verse. We already mentioned about this verse that this is an event that had not yet been fulfilled. We looked at all the various historic events up until the end of verse 44. And we learned last time we were together that verse 44 was specifically talking about the Crimean War, and that after verse 44, there was going to be two more specific events that verse 45 outlines, which were going to take place and were supposed to take place in the near future during the ministry of Ellen White and the pioneers. Now, we understood by looking at that verse, and we're just going to look at it once more again, that the two events spoken of there, just by looking at the language that was used in this particular verse, we see that there's event number one, which speaks about the planting of his tabernacles between the seas in the glorious holy mountain. That was event number 1. And event number 2 refers to coming to his end. As we continue reading through the book of Daniel, we see that the very next verse tells us that at that time, at the time of what verse 45 speaks about in the beginning of that verse, Michael shall stand up, the great prince which standeth for the children of thy people. We know that the standing up of Michael is in reference to the close of human probation. He stands up so he can receive the kingdom. The investigative judgment is over. Everybody that is part of that kingdom has already been accounted. Probation closes, Michael stands up, and the 7 last plagues begin to be poured out on this earth. It was extremely important for us to understand the timing of verse 45 and of the 2 events that are found there. So when the Bible says, and at that time shall Michael stand up, the Bible is specifically speaking about the time when the king of the north, which we already established in the previous presentation, that is speaking about the Turkish nation, being the Ottoman Empire in the 18th and 19th centuries, will, according to the Bible, plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas in the glorious holy mountain. And then, at that time, Michael shall stand up. For yet he shall come to his end is an event that is presented to take place into the future. And when we compare Scripture with Scripture, we find the fulfillment of that coming to his end connected or found in the book of Revelation with reference to the 6th plague, which is not something we're going to touch upon today, but we're going to be looking at that connection. So extremely important as we look at this diagram to understand the timing. When Turkey plants its tabernacles of his palace between the seas and the glorious mountain, as soon as that event takes place on this earth, it is then that the close of probation will come upon everyone that lives on this earth. And then we have a period of about a year left for the outpouring of the 7th last plagues. So shortly after the close of probation, as we come into the 6th plague, we find the fulfillment of this same very power coming to his end. Now, as it is with many different prophecies in the Bible and understandings in the Bible, there are different opinions with respect to the fulfillment of this verse. Many within Seventh-day Adventist circles, unfortunately, departed from what the church used to speak or teach with respect to the Eastern question as things really subsided in the world. And I already mentioned that last time, but it's important to understand. And we'll look at it now from history again. A new understanding came about. People could not see how these verses would actually be fulfilled because of certain events that were taking place in the world. And to be fair, there was reasoning in that line of thought, but at the same time, it wasn't a misunderstanding of the prophecy that didn't bring about the fulfillment of verse 45, but rather the church going, spiritually speaking, back into the wilderness after its rejection of the righteousness by faith message. You see, when we travel back in time, when we go around the year 1888 and then move forward into the next few years, we see that various world events were beginning to take place because God was preparing to take his people home. He was beginning to pour out the latter rain, which was necessary for them in order to go through the final time of trouble. Blue Sunday laws were coming into the United States. The fulfillment of verse 45 was right there at the door. But because of lack of faith in God's people, things subsided, got delayed, and here we are over 100 years past that period. And that's why it's important to know that the lack of fulfillment in verse 45 back into the 19th and beginning of 20th century was not due to a misunderstanding of the prophecy, but rather the result of the church not being ready for translation. So let's now, with all these thoughts, begin to look at some history and some facts that will help us to have a proper understanding of these verses. I want us to take us back into the beginning of the creation of the Ottoman Empire. There's something extremely important for us to understand here. Here's a paragraph from Encyclopedia Britannica. And there, the encyclopedia speaks about what we refer to as the founder of that country, empire, nation, whatever we want to call it. And that was a man by the name of Osman I. He was a ruler of a Turkmen principality in northwestern Anatolia, who is regarded as the founder of the Ottoman Turkish state. Both the name of the dynasty and the empire that the dynasty established are derived from the Arabic form Uthman of his name. Osman was descended from the Kaya branch of the Oghuz Turkmen. Now, why am I bringing this up? And why is this important for us to recognize who it was that started this empire? Because the man that started this empire, even though he was able to unite people from various ethnic backgrounds, was actually a person from a Turkish background. So the Ottoman Empire united different people from various ethnic backgrounds, but the empire itself was based on the Turkish nationality, the Turkish ethnicity. That's who the founder was. They embraced some of their Arabic brothers, but we know that ethnically speaking, the Turks and the Arabs are not one and the same group of people. They're two separate ethnic groups. I am bringing this out for a reason. The reason is that many people have in the last few years searched for fulfillment of Daniel 11:45 in connection to the transition of the Ottoman Empire to what it has become known today as the Republic of Turkey. And in their minds, it is because the Ottoman Empire transitioned and was no longer known as the Ottoman Empire, this particular verse must have already been fulfilled in the year 1922 when the Ottoman Empire fell apart. However, that is an improper interpretation of the prophecy, and I'm going to now use an illustration to demonstrate why that is the case. I've used that in the past. You all know that I come from the nation, the country of Bulgaria. I am Bulgarian. Bulgaria is still around. Bulgaria has not yet come to its end, and I am a product of that nation. Now, I am in no way, shape, or form nationalistic. There's only one nation or one city I would like to be a part of, and that is the New Jerusalem. So I'm not trying to be nationalistic in any way, shape, or form. I'm just using this as a plain example. So all of you here know that I am Bulgarian because I came from Bulgaria. Well, if we travel back in time, if we go back to the 900s, you will know from history that at that particular period in history, Bulgaria was not known as the Republic of Bulgaria, as it is known today, but rather, during the rule of one particular king, historically speaking, Bulgaria was known as the Bulgarian Empire. Now, the Bulgarian Empire is no longer around because the Republic of Bulgaria is here today in the 21st century. But because the Bulgarian Empire is not around, does that mean that Bulgaria has already come to an end? That the Bulgarian nation has been eradicated? Of course not. There are still Bulgarians in the world. They are still the country of Bulgaria. They're still the nation of Bulgaria. And it is very similar with the Turkish Empire. You see, Osman was a Turkmen. Ethnically speaking, he was a Turkish person. He started an empire. And then in the year 1922, that empire fell apart so that the Republic of Turkey can come around. So you see how the fact that the empire is no longer around does not give a fulfillment of verse 45, because when the Bible says that something, that a nation is going to come to its end, it means end literally. That is it. That nation is no longer going to be there. But just as the nation of Bulgaria is still around, even though the Bulgarian Empire is long gone, so it is with Turkey. The Turkish nation is still around, but today it is a republic, which is what most of the nations and countries around the world are today. So Turkey has not come to its end as of yet. That is still an event to be fulfilled into the future. Moreover, we already explained by looking at the diagram that the sixth plague of Revelation specifically talks about that ending. That is our second reason for the understanding of why Turkey has not yet come to its end. And we're going to talk more and more about that. The ending of Turkey as a nation is found in the sixth plague, and it is, I think, fair to say that we have not been living in the outpouring of the seven last plagues. This is something yet to happen in the future. The close of probation is yet to take place. So in order for all these events to happen, we first need to look at history and current events and recognize when event number one will take place, which deals with the planting of the tabernacles of his palace. And as that comes around, the close of probation will come, the beginning of the outpouring of the seven last plagues will start, and then as we get into the sixth plague, we will have the literal ending of this nation once and for all. And we'll look into that as we continue studying this very subject. So let's look at event number one. Let's learn a little bit more from the Bible with respect to event number one and understand it biblically so that there's no confusion in our minds. Event number one says that Turkey will plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas in the glorious holy mountain. We already spoke about the locality as to what that is specifically talking about. The glorious holy mountain between the seas is in reference to Jerusalem. We established that, but I would like us to focus now on that first phrase and the meaning of that first phrase so that there's no confusion with respect to that phrase. It says that the king of the north will plant the tabernacles of his palace, singular, in Jerusalem. That is what the Bible is telling us that it's going to happen. So let's travel back in history and let's see how this also, just as the second portion of the verse, had not yet been fulfilled. If the Ottoman Empire, or the Ottoman Empire falling apart, was a fulfillment of the second portion of the verse, then we must have had a fulfillment of the first portion of the verse. It would only make sense. But that has not been the case. So let's open our concordance and look at this phrase and look specifically at the word tabernacles in connection to palace. So the phrase in this verse says the tabernacles of his palace, singular. So a palace has different tabernacles. That is the language. That is what the Bible says. Well, what does the word tabernacles mean? Well, simply put, the word tabernacle or tabernacles is in reference to a dwelling place. The majority of the time, it has been translated as tabernacle or as tent throughout the Bible because this is the kind of dwelling places that people in those days had. Most people that lived a few thousand years ago lived in tents. In fact, the sanctuary that Moses erected into the wilderness was one big tent because this is how things functioned back then. But the meaning ultimately is that the tabernacles of his palace is really in reference to the tents of his palace, the dwelling places of his palace. So one palace has different dwelling places. That's what the verse tells us. There's been unnecessary confusion with respect to this verse, just as it is with everything else. But when we understand it from the Bible and when we connect it to some modern day understanding of its meaning, it becomes fairly simple. So in the language of a 21st century, do we all live in tents today for the most part? And the answer is no, we don't live in tents. I am currently in a building that has been erected, and I am in a particular room that we have dedicated to the work that we do. So let's take this phrase and translate it into a 21st century concept. Here's a picture of a palace that has several different tabernacles. I think we all know what picture we are looking at. We are looking at the White House found in Washington, D.C. in the United States of America. So to translate the tabernacles of his palace into modern day terms, we simply say that the tabernacles of who is today's president of the United States, Joe Biden. So the tabernacles of Joe Biden's palace is the White House. The White House is that palace, singular, and inside the White House we have different tabernacles. Here's a picture of the different tabernacles that you can find in the White House, in the palace of the President of the United States of America. You've got the East Wing and you've got the West Wing. You've got the residence in the middle. All these are different tabernacles in connection to the palace that belongs to the leader of the United States of America. See, we don't dwell in tents anymore. If we lived a few thousand years ago, we would have said, well, here are the tents that belong to the leader of this country. So the East Wing would have been a tent, the West Wing would have been a tent, a big tent, and even within that big tent you could have different divisions, different areas, different dwelling places that you could live in. But this is basically a simplified 21st version of what this phrase, the tabernacles of his palace, singular, speaks about. It speaks about the location of where the president of a republic resides in. Now let me ask you the next question. Where is the White House located? What place in the country is the White House located in? And what is that connected to? Well, it's found in Washington, D.C. Why is the White House, the tabernacles of the palace of Joe Biden, found in Washington, D.C.? It is found there because that's where the capital of the nation is. So the tabernacles, the palace, is located based on the choice of the capital and not the other way around. You don't build a palace somewhere and say, you know what, we're going to have the capital here. It's the choice of the capital that then leads you to bring a palace within that capital. And this is why within the writings of the Adventist pioneers, and this is why the interpretation of the Bible speaks to that, we are looking at an event where the king of the north, Turkey, was going to move its capital from wherever it was found, and it is found today, to Jerusalem. And in order to recognize that, we're going to see that there's going to be a palace there in Jerusalem that is going to serve as the White House of the Turkish leader. This is what happens. You choose the capital, and based on your location of the capital, that is where you go and you move your White House or your palace. Question: has Turkey as a nation ever moved its capital to Jerusalem at any point in history? When we look at the Ottoman Empire and then when we transition into the Republic of Turkey, has there ever been a move of the capital to Jerusalem? Well, let's learn from history by looking at the tabernacles of the Turkish palace. Where have they been located? Here's the Dolmabahce Palace. And the Dolmabahce Palace was located in the Beşiktaş district of Istanbul or Constantinople, Turkey, on the European coast of the Bosphorus Strait. And it served as the main administrative center of the Ottoman Empire from 1856 to 1887 and from 1909 to 1922. Yildiz Palace was used in the interim period, which was also located right there in Istanbul and Constantinople. Now, why is that? Why is the Dolmabahce Palace located in Constantinople? Because that's where the Ottomans chose their capital to be. You choose the capital, and then the leader of the country erects its palace there. Now, notice that the Turks even use the very word palace in order to make sure that we do not get confused when it comes to the interpretation of this prophecy. So we know that up until the year 1922, Constantinople was chosen as the capital of the Ottoman Empire. Now, what happened as the Ottoman Empire transitioned from no longer being the Ottoman Empire, but now to the Republic of Turkey? Well, there was a new palace that was erected, and it is known as the Çankaya Mansion. And the Çankaya Mansion was the official residence of the President of Turkey from the year 1923 to the year 2014. Now, where is this mansion found? Well, this mansion is found in Ankara, a different city from Constantinople. Now, why was this palace erected in Ankara? Well, because as the Ottoman Empire transitioned into a republic, a new capital was chosen for that Turkish nation. It was no longer going to be Constantinople or Istanbul. The capital was now moved from there to Ankara. And then in 2014, there was an upgrade in that same very place. And now the Turkish president has his own White House, or as this article refers to it, White Palace. And within that White Palace, you have 1,100 different dwelling places or different tabernacles. This is what the verse, or this is the meaning of this phrase, the tabernacles of his palace. It is referring to the location of the capital of a nation. The palace is built within the capital. You choose the capital and then you build the palace, not the other way around. So historically speaking, we know that there has never been a move of the capital of the Turkish nation to Jerusalem as of yet. And since there hasn't been a move as of yet, there has been no fulfillment of Daniel 11 verse 45. So now let's travel back in history and let's look at what it is and what it was meant by the phrase the Eastern question, specifically during the 19th century, and how that is connected to the very verse that we're looking at, Daniel 11 verse 45. We're going to begin with a statement found in Encyclopedia Britannica. So where does this phrase come from? Is this something the Seventh-day Adventist pioneers came up with? No, of course not. When we look into the pages of history, this was actually a term that had become well known within society because there was something taking place right around that time as God was preparing his people for translation. The Eastern question was a phrase that the church used in order to attract people to the Bible, to the interpretation of Daniel chapter 11, and ultimately use that as an evangelistic tool to bring them to a knowledge of the three angels' messages. So Encyclopedia Britannica tells us what the Eastern question was all about. It says it was a diplomatic problem posed in the 19th and early 20th centuries by the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire, centering on the contest for control of former Ottoman territories. Any internal change in the Turkish domains caused tension among the European powers, each of which feared that one of the others might take advantage of the political disarray to increase its own influence. So as the Ottoman Empire was losing strength, which is what did the Bible say? The Bible says that first, yes, it's going to move its capital to Jerusalem, but then it's going to come to its end. So it was natural for the Ottoman Empire to be losing strength. As the Ottoman Empire was losing strength, more and more nations were becoming interested in various territories that the Ottomans held on to. Let's learn a little bit more from Oxford University Press. It says, Turkey's weakness became apparent in a series of wars with Russia in the late 18th century. The British feared that if the Turkish Empire broke up, Russian power would threaten the British Empire in India. The Crimean War of 1854 to 1856, in which Britain, France, and Turkey fought Russia, was the result of miscalculations arising from France and Russia's over-vigorous championing of the rights of Turkey's Catholic and Orthodox Christians, respectively, and Britain's fears that Russia wished to seize Constantinople. Now, we already talked about the Crimean War, because verse 44 in Daniel chapter 11 specifically talked about the Crimean War. So as the Crimean War was taking place, as Russia was coming into the picture and was trying to take advantage of the Bosphorus, this territory that was found that connected Europe and Asia, a very strategic location, the people of the world were looking. They were, they didn't have CNN and all these networks back then, but they had their ears on what was taking place, because this was an event that was taking place in the world, and all the nations, the big players in the world, were extremely interested in what was happening to the Ottoman Empire. So the Adventist pioneers, recognizing that verse 44 speaks specifically about the Crimean War, and it speaks about the things that are just about to happen into the next verse, began to bring the attention of people from the world to this conflict, so that people of the world could connect the phrase, the Eastern question, with the interpretation of Daniel chapter 11. And when you make that connection, then you're brought into an understanding of prophecy. This is why I have said on numerous occasions that this subject was, and yet again will be, as we shall see just in a second, used as an evangelistic tool to arrest the attention of the world. Verse 45 will be connected to current events, and the world will be looking at these current events, as it already is in a certain sense. And we as God's people can use that to attract them to the Bible, to prophecy, and ultimately from there take them in and help them understand the whole concept of the gospel and the work of the three angels' messages. Nationalist feelings, coming back to this Oxford University Press statement, nationalist feelings in the Balkans grew, and the problem flared up again in the 1870s. The Bosnians rose in 1875, followed by the Bulgarians in 1876. Russia declared war on Turkey, but the other powers thought the Treaty of San Stefano too favorable to Russia and amended it at the Congress of Berlin. That year, 1877, is when we looked at one statement specifically coming from Ellen White with reference to the teachings of Uriah Smith, again at a camp meeting. The one we looked at today was from 1884, but if we remember, we already looked at statements that were found in 1877 and 1878, because these things, these events that were taking place, were in connection to the soon fall of the Ottoman Empire. But if things had gone in accordance with God's will, if the church had embraced righteousness by faith and prepared itself to see their Lord and Savior face to face, Turkey would have truly come to its complete end. It would not have transitioned to become a republic as it did in the year 1923. It would have been completely destroyed. But that didn't happen. The fulfillment of verse 45 was pushed into the future because God's people were not ready. There always has been an interest in those areas. We read in the beginning of this statement here from Oxford University Press that Russia was extremely interested into Constantinople. In fact, if we look at the will of Peter the Great, we're going to find that this has been their interest for quite some time. It wasn't just an interest that was found there in the 19th century. It is an interest that travels back through years. We know that that place, that city, Istanbul today, or Constantinople, the city that Constantine himself named after his own self and moved the capital of the Roman Empire to, has been a location of a great interest of the various nations. Ever since it has come into an existence, because it is a particular location that connects Europe and Asia and allows for many different things and control of various economic as well as other influences because of the possession of that particular land. So here's the will of Peter the Great, and he specifically talks about that. He specifically talks about Constantinople. He says, do all in your power to approach closely Constantinople. He's speaking about what Russia needs to do. And India. Remember that he who rules over these countries is the real sovereign of the world. Keep up continued wars with Turkey and with Persia. Establish dockyards in the Black Sea. Gradually obtain the command of this sea as well as of the Baltic. This is necessary for the entire success of our projects. Russia has been after this area for a long time. He wasn't after this area only in the 19th century. So let's connect that to the Bible. What was so specific about Russia going after Constantinople, and what was that going to bring about? I'm actually going to quote a pioneer just so that we can understand how they connected the Eastern question, because that's what we're studying. We're studying the Eastern question as it was understood back then to the prophecies in the book of Daniel. A.T. Jones put actually a small booklet, and the booklet was entitled The Eastern Question. And in that booklet, we read, and now the last verse of Daniel, speaking about Daniel 11:45 of Daniel 11, tells of the two events that all Europe is constantly expecting to see, and which are certain soon to take place, namely the expulsion of the Turkish power from Constantinople and the wiping out of the Ottoman Empire. These are the words of the angel as to this looked for event. And then he goes on and he quotes Daniel 11:45. So the world and the Adventist people were looking for a fulfillment of that verse. They were anticipating something to take place. Now let me share with you quickly a map of what the Ottoman Empire looked around this time, the end of the 19th century. There was something extremely important for us to understand and compare to what the Turkish Republic looks like today. As you can see, Turkey was a much bigger power in those years. Even though it was still declining and declining, it had under its control a much larger territory than it does today. So what the church, what Seventh-day Adventists were anticipating was for this Russian-Ottoman conflict to increase, where Russia herself would be able to seize full control of all the Balkans and all the territories on the European side of the continent and push the Ottomans down further south away from Europe. Now, at that time, Constantinople was the capital of the country, of the Ottoman Empire. So if the Russians were able to seize control of all the European territories, the natural thing for the Ottoman Empire would have been to move its capital to another location. And according to the Bible, that location was going to be Jerusalem. At that time, the Ottomans had Palestine under their control. And it would have been the most natural thing for them to move their capital automatically to Jerusalem as Russia was pushing onto them, trying to get them out of Europe and seize control of Constantinople. This is what the Eastern question in the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century revolved around. This is what the Adventist pioneers were anticipating and waiting. They were waiting for Russia specifically because this was the conflict present then. There was a conflict between Russia and the Ottoman Empire. And they were anticipating Russia to become victorious and to follow through with what we just read from the will of Peter the Great, seizing control of Constantinople. And once that happened, then the Ottomans would have automatically moved their capital to Jerusalem, and then just shortly after, as we get into the sixth plague, they would have been eradicated as a nation completely. They would have completely come to their end. That was the Eastern question to Adventists. This is what they were anticipating. Now we know that after World War I, there were certain changes that took place, and Turkey today does not hold as much territory as it used to. So let's now try to understand what it is that the prophecy would require in order to be fulfilled today. What about the Eastern question today? Is the Eastern question, is that phrase as widely spoken about as it was back then, in the same light as it was back then? Not really. A few years ago, there was an article in the BBC that dates back to 2016, and it said, Turkey, the Eastern question is back. Now, if we go around and we ask people off the street and ask them, well, do you know what the Eastern question is about? Most people nowadays would not be able to connect with that phrase, because that phrase is not widely used in the news, and it was used in the 19th century. It was in every newspaper article. Everybody was talking about the Eastern question, the Eastern question, the Eastern question, the Eastern question. So for us today to only be using this phrase would not bring the same success as it did for the Adventist pioneers, because things have changed a little bit. Turkey is no longer in possession of the territory that it used to have when the Ottoman Empire was around. So what happened historically speaking? What are some of these changes, and how can we adjust our thinking so we can use this information just as great as it was used by the pioneers? Well, let's look at history and see what happened to Jerusalem. So in 1917, the British forces entered Palestine, and by 1918, the Ottoman rule over Palestine was ended following the defeat of the forces at the Battle of Megiddo in September 1918. We know that the Ottoman Empire, or Turkey, no longer possesses Israel or Jerusalem. It's not part of their territory. So in order for the prophecy to be fulfilled, there's going to be a slightly different set of current events that are going to be connected to the fulfillment of that prophecy. Do we have a Russian-Turkish war going on at the moment, where Russia is trying to seize control of the European territories that belong to Turkey? Not now. Could we have one? Oh, absolutely. All the nations of the world will be interested in that territory. But at the same time, we know that Jerusalem now is no longer in possession of the Turks. So if the prophecy says that first and foremost they need to move their capital to Jerusalem, then we are to know that there's going to be something in connection to Jerusalem coming from this power, Turkey, or the King of the North. There needs to be a little bit of an adjustment of the way we present the information, because the history is not identical to what was happening in the 19th century. On October 29, 1923, the Assembly declared Turkey to be a republic and elected Mustafa Kemal as its first president. Here's another piece of information that we need to be aware of that can help us to point people to why this interpretation of these verses is indeed in connection to the proper fulfillment of prophecy. So, the Ottoman Empire was put together, as we read earlier, by the Turkish man called Osman or Othman. Now, what he managed to do very well was to not just unite all the Turkish people together, but bring in a lot of the Arab world together. And what glued that empire together and made it so successful was religion. Islam was at the core of the functioning of the Ottoman Empire. However, in the year 1923, that connection between religion and the state was completely eradicated. The Caliphate was abolished on March 3rd, 1924, and all members of the Ottoman dynasty were expelled from Turkey. A full republican constitution was adopted on April 20th, 1924. It retained Islam as the state religion, but in April 1928, this clause was removed and Turkey became a purely secular republic. It is due to these events that many people in the Seventh-day Adventist Church began to doubt the interpretation of the prophecy in those years, in the 1920s and in the 1930s and 40s. Turkey no longer held Jerusalem. Jerusalem is a very special place for the three major religions on earth. It is the third holiest city in Islam. So if religion was in no way, shape, or form going to be part of that country, then why in the world would Turkey go after Jerusalem? So many people began to doubt the proper interpretation of the prophecy when they actually had not recognized that the prophecy was not being fulfilled, not because it was misinterpreted, but because God's people went back into the wilderness. The Republic of Turkey, entirely based on secular principles. Well, if that is the case, then what interest would they have in Jerusalem to begin with? It's a fair question. Not much, if it's now no longer driven by this Islamic connection. Israel is no longer, or rather Jerusalem is no longer the third holiest city because Turkey now became a republic based on secularistic principles and not based on the religious principles that drove the Ottoman Empire. But things have been transpiring over the years, and things have actually started to change. Now, I want to talk a little bit about an event that took place where we can see how serious secularistic values had become part of that nation as it was originally started in the year 1923. The separation between religion and the state was one of the most, if not the most important objective of the leader who began the republic. And over the years, any voted president who in any way, shape, or form tried to bring back religious values into the country was immediately attacked by the army. The army was there to protect the secularistic principle found in that republic. And look at actually what happened in the years shortly in the midst of the 20th century to some of these leaders who attempted to bring back religious values into the country. Already during the electoral campaign of 1950, 7 of the 24 parties advocated a greater role for religion. The victory of the conservative religious Democratic Party of Adnan Menderes signified a comprehensive return of Islam to the public sphere. So here comes a man who is trying to bring back Islam to the public sphere within the secularistic Republic of Turkey. This was followed by a boom in the construction of mosques, new state Quran classes, and theological colleges were established. The DP had become an institutionalized catch-all party for those who were weary of elitist Kemalism, Kemal Atatürk being the original founder of the Republic of Turkey, with the idea of that republic being based entirely and only on secularistic values, of elitist Kemalism, peasants, small businessmen, members of religious orders and brotherhoods, and especially the inhabitants of the Anatolian periphery. Now, what happened to this particular individual? Adnan Menderes. His attempt to do so actually failed. Because in the year 1960, the militia organized a coup, captured him, and hanged him so he can become an example to all the future leaders who were going to attempt to bring back Islam within this secularistic nation. Jerusalem was not on their radar, and any leader of any kind who tried to bring back Islam into that country, into that nation, was opposed by the local army, which was given the power to control and to organize different coups so that no leader can accomplish that. And this man, Adnan Menderes, served as an example to all the future leaders who are going to attempt to do the exact same thing that he tried. He was hanged alongside with, I believe, two of his ministers, and that served as an example. The local army gave an example for all future leaders that Turkey was not going to return to its Islamic connection. It was to remain as a secular country, a republic that had nothing to do with Islam. So why am I bringing this idea up? It is because, as we learned, Jerusalem is no longer part of Turkey. So Turkey has to have some sort of an interest in Jerusalem in order for the prophecy to be fulfilled. Well, we move forward in time. Menderes did not succeed. But as we transitioned into the future, as we come near the end of the 20th century, there was another man who was walking into his footsteps who was going to try to accomplish this. And that man is the current president of the Turkish Republic, Mr. Erdogan. So let's learn a little bit about him and why it is so important, why he has become the president and has ruled in that country for quite some time already, and how is that connected to current events and to the fulfillment of Daniel chapter 11, verse 45. In the 1970s and 80s, he was active in Islamist circles, speaking about Erdogan, joining Necmettin Erbakan's pro-Islamic welfare party. As the party grew in popularity in the 1990s, Mr. Erdogan was elected as its candidate for mayor of Istanbul in 1994 and ran the city for the next 4 years. In August 2001, he founded a new Islamist-rooted party with an ally, Abdullah Gül. In 2002, his newly created party, the AKP, won a majority in parliamentary elections, and the following year, Mr. Erdogan was appointed prime minister. He remains chairman of the AKP, or Justice and Development Party, to this day. So where is this guy coming from? Well, he's coming from the same values that the very man in the 1960s who was hanged. This was an individual who wanted to bring back Islam into the country. This was his goal, and this is what he wanted to achieve. But remember, we're in politics here. Things in politics are fairly dirty, and you have to have an agenda, and you have to know how to achieve what you want to achieve. He already had the example of what happened to that prime minister several decades ago. And he was going to face the same difficulties in order to be successful. But what has happened in recent history? What has Erdogan achieved that Menderes was not able to achieve before him? Let's look at a little bit more. Erdogan has long championed Islamist causes and was known to give the four-finger salute of Egypt's repressed Muslim Brotherhood. In July 2020, he oversaw the conversion of Istanbul's historic Hagia Sophia into a mosque, angering many Christians. Built 1,500 years ago as a cathedral, it was made into a mosque by the Ottoman Turks, but Ataturk, who was he? The founder of the Republic of Turkey, had turned it into a museum, a symbol of the new secular state. So as you can see, throughout history, every ruler has tried to do something in order to present to the people what they stand for, their ideologies. I would like you to do your own personal study about this now president, no longer prime minister, but serving president of Turkey. In fact, the BBC put out a documentary, a two-part series documentary that goes and follows his life from the beginning up until today. It presents what his values are, how he has been able to stay in power, and what he is after. Erdogan, unlike Menderes, was actually successful in overturning the local army. Just as Menderes, the local army attempted a coup against him. But for the first time in Turkish history, he was able to seize full control of the nation and full control of all the powers within that nation and bring back Islamistic values into the nation. For the first time ever in history, since Turkey became a strictly secularistic state, we see an interest of Jerusalem with respect to Jerusalem. Why? Because Jerusalem is the third holiest city in Islam. So in order for a Turkish Republic to be interested in Jerusalem again, those values, those religious values needed to be brought back, and we see before our very eyes that taking place. That tells us something. That tells us that we're getting near to the fulfillment of Daniel 11:45. If there was no way for that prophecy to be fulfilled in 1923, when Turkey transitioned into a strictly secularistic republic without any interest or without anything related to bringing back Islam, if the army was able to put and hang, to take the life of the candidate who tried to achieve that in the 1950s and 60s, and if today we have a man who was able to achieve this for the very first time in the history of this republic, brothers and sisters, this tells us that as we look at these events taking place in the world, we are also getting closer to the end of time. The fulfillment of Daniel 11:45 becomes a possibility. Here's Erdogan himself speaking about Jerusalem specifically. He desires to see a Palestinian state with Jerusalem as capital if we want to see any stability in the Middle East. Here's him again. Jerusalem is our city, Turkey's Erdogan declares. Why is it their city? Because it's the third holiest city in Islam. Because the values that this man holds on to are connected to the same ideologies that were found in the Ottoman Empire. Here's a quote just from January 1st, 2024, in the address that his own very son gave. So this is Bilal Erdogan. This is the son of the president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan. That's his son. In his address on January 1st, 2024, he says the following. He said that the boycott of Israel would not end with a ceasefire. What is taking place in the Middle East right now? Isn't there a tension taking place between Palestine and Israel? Isn't that what the whole world is looking at? Why are they looking at? Why is there conflict in the Middle East that surrounds Jerusalem? Why is Turkey interested in Jerusalem? Here's what he says. He said that the boycott of Israel would not end with a ceasefire. Erdogan stated that his father, breaking the fetters of Hagia Sophia, we just read about that. Remember that church that the Ottomans converted into a mosque, and then the founder of the Republic of Turkey converted into a museum so that everything related to Islam can be eliminated from that nation. And now Erdogan turning it back into a mosque. It's a statement. It's a statement of what is taking place in the country. The Ottoman Empire made it into a mosque. Why? Because that was the ideology that drove the Ottoman Empire. That's why Osman, the creator of the Ottoman Empire, was able to bring back and create this empire, because he united not just the Turks, but the Arabs as well, on the basis of religion. When Ataturk started the Republic of Turkey, he said, you know what, we're not going to function this way. We're going to eliminate anything closely related to religion, and we're going to make a statement. We're going to convert Hagia Sophia now to a museum so that people understand that religion has no place in this nation anymore. And here comes Erdogan, for the first time in history. A president, a leader of the country, being able to seize control of all the different powers that are found within a nation, being driven by the same religious ideology as it was found back in the Ottoman Empire. And his son says, Erdogan stated that his father breaking the fetters of Hagia Sophia by converting it back into a mosque was the first step towards freedom for Jerusalem and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. January 1st, 2024. We're looking at current events, brothers and sisters. This is why it's so important to understand the fulfillment of Daniel 11:45. While some people completely have ran away from the interpretation of the prophecy as it was presented in the 19th century through the Eastern Question conflict by all the pioneers, while others are saying that the 1145 was already completed in the year 1922 when the Ottoman Empire ceased to be the Ottoman Empire, God is looking for His people to have a proper interpretation, not so that we can feel that we know more than anybody else, but so you and I, brothers and sisters, can look at current events and use these current events to do what the pioneers did. There's a lot happening in the world, and Daniel 11:45 tells us that Turkey will not only be interested in Jerusalem, but according to the prophecy, Turkey will move its capital to Jerusalem. And what would be the natural thing to happen after that? What would happen if tomorrow the Turkish president says that he's going to go and unite with the Palestinians? They're going to become one nation, for example, and this is just a hypothetical. And he moves his capital from Ankara to Jerusalem. What would that tell the world? What would happen in the world if that takes place? Well, we don't need to guess, because the Bible has told us that He will come to His end. This is why all these conflicts in the Middle East taking place in the last few years are so important. And this is why our focus now has to be not only specifically about what was taking place surrounding the issue of Constantinople, but there's so much more, so many more current events taking place in the Middle East that we can use in order to attract people and to give them an interpretation of Bible prophecy and connect them to the sovereign of the universe, who is the only one who knows the end from the beginning. So in summary, we looked at Daniel 11:45 and we learned that the interpretation of Daniel 11:45 was connected to the Eastern question, a phrase that was coined by the world and not by the church. The church just utilized it in order to get people's attention and interest into these matters. We learned that Daniel 11:45 is related to the controversies that surround Jerusalem and Turkey today as we move forward in time. We know for a fact that Turkey will move its capital to Jerusalem, and as the second portion of that verse says, ultimately be destroyed as a nation. That has not yet taken place. The fact that Turkey transitioned from being the Ottoman Empire to the Republic of Turkey cannot be a fulfillment of 1145, because that nation is still around, and we're going to look more at that as we study the sixth plague in particular in connection to this very subject. And lastly, and most importantly, for the first time in history, we have seen a change in the Turkish government that points us and suggests a renewed interest by the king of the north in Jerusalem, which would have to be there if that power is going to end up moving its capital there. The biggest connecting link is the religious connection between Jerusalem and the state power. As the third holiest city in Islam, it is a place that everybody in the Middle East is fighting for at the moment. And we should know that every prophecy that has been given to us, one way or another, will be fulfilled at the time appointed. The time wasn't appointed for this prophecy to be fulfilled at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century because God's church wasn't ready. But what about today? That is the question we really need to answer. If we want to see the fulfillment of the prophecy, brothers and sisters, we need to see a fulfillment of the character of Christ in me, in us. Else, things will again be pushed further and further into the future. Things will be delayed more and more. We're going to continue to wander into the wilderness. So as it is with every single message in the Bible and with every single study, whether it be prophecy or anything else, we ought to remember that everything God has given us is to be understood in connection to Christ. And this is what I want us to leave us with. We see a lot of current events, we see a lot of history, we see a lot of reason as to why the fulfillment of Daniel 11:45 is coming. And Christ is here to invite me, to invite you to continue walking with Him, to recognize our shortcomings and the things that need to be changed, because only a group of people that are ready to reflect His character are going to be able to give the loud cry and walk through those 7 last plagues that are going to be poured out on this earth.